everybody. I am Roger Waldinger. I'm professor of sociology, director of the Center for the Study of International Migration, and I am delighted to welcome you to today's event. This is a book talk that we are co-sponsoring with our friends and colleagues at the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at UC San Diego, part of our year-long series with meetings that occur every Friday at this time. In winter quarter, as some of you may know, we have been alternating between book talks and the Emerging Scholars workshops. And the last such workshop will take place next Friday. And it will focus on immigration and the law with 3 papers by Daisy Del Real, Jane Lopez, and Carrie Rosenbaum, and a comment by Jennifer Chacon of the UCLA School of Law. So today I am delighted to segue to the book talk, and we are delighted to have Nazita Lajevardi from political science from Michigan State, who will talk about her new book, Outsiders at Home, The Politics of American Islamophobia. Nazita will talk for roughly 20 to 25 minutes, and then she'll be followed by David Sears, professor of political science and psychology at UCLA, who will talk for roughly 10 to 15 minutes. The floor will go back to Nazita, and then we will open up for Q&A with the audience. So if you would send me comments, questions in the chat, or raise your hand, we will then, I'll then call on you. But first, let me give the floor to Nazita, and who will tell us about her book.
Thank you all so much for being here today. I feel really blessed to be here. My background is in political science, both at UCSD and UCLA. So both are my alma maters. And I'm really excited to share with you a little bit about my book today. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So today I'm going to talk to you about this book that came out in about May 2020, so really at the height of the pandemic. The book is entitled Outsiders at Home, The Politics of American Islamophobia. So before I get started really talking about the crux of the argument of the book and the tests that I conduct, I want to talk a little bit about who American Muslims are. So in the United States, we have about 3.45 million Muslims who live here. But actually, Islam is a very large religion. There's an estimated 1.6 to 2.1 billion adherents globally. And as such, Islam is the second largest religious grouping behind Christianity. It's the fastest growing religion in the world today, and the Muslim population is forecasted to increase by 35% over the next 20 years. The Pew Research Center is the entity that's responsible for having estimated the size of the Muslim population living in the United States. But I'm going to get to this later on. It's actually quite difficult to determine the true size of the Muslim American population in the United States because the United States Census doesn't actually track this information. And so as I'm going to highlight later on, this actually challenges our ability to ask questions of a representative sample of American Muslims. One thing that I think is really important and perhaps notable for this group of people is that many US Muslims are newcomers to the United States. So about over 50% of Muslims in America are immigrants. And between 1992 and 2012, about 1.7 million of the 3.5 million Muslims who are here today arrived to the country. And so you can see that there were only 50,000 Muslims who arrived to the United States in 1992 compared to about 100,000 in 2012. So there's been a steady rise of immigrants coming to the United States. But it's also important to highlight that Islam is, or at least the Muslim population in the United States is an incredibly diverse population. The first Muslims who arrived to this country actually extend back to the early 16th century. So there was an African Muslim named Estefan who actually accompanied the Spanish as a guide to the New World in the early 16th century. And then of course, in the 1600s, 30% of enslaved Africans who arrived to the United States were of the Muslim faith. So that is to say that Muslims have been in America for at least 400 years. But I want to talk a little bit about the group today, and so I'm going to give some insights quickly from the Pew 2017 survey. Pew conducted a survey of American Muslims in 2017. It's the third of its kind. It's conducted surveys in 2007, 2011, and now 2017. It's the most representative survey we've got of American Muslims because they use random digit dialing and invest between $1 to $3 million per survey. So to begin here, I'm going to talk about the table to the left. Only 24% of Muslims are US born with US born parents. In fact, most Muslims, about 58%, are immigrants and were born abroad. And only 18% of US Muslims are like me. They were born here, but their parents were born abroad, which means that we can't actually be thinking about US Muslims without thinking about migration and thinking about immigration policy. Moving on to the next table on the right, it's also important to highlight that there's a great deal of racial diversity among US Muslims, as I indicated earlier. So when we use pan-ethnic terms, I'm saying this in quotation marks, of how to classify Muslims, you can see that actually the idea of the Middle Eastern Muslim person that we may have in the American imaginary actually hides and obfuscates quite a bit of the Muslim population. Insofar as 1/5 of American Muslims are Black and 8% of the US Muslim population is Hispanic and growing. 41% here identify as white, but as we'll see later on, this is because the white category is subsuming individuals from the Middle East and North Africa. So a great deal of racial diversity among the population. As we were talking a little bit earlier, please recall that foreign-born US immigrants in the Muslim population constitute 58%, but a majority of these people, 56% of the 58%, arrived in the United States in 2000 or later, so making them quite recent arrivals to the country. Only 35% of the foreign-born Muslim immigrant population came to the United States between 1970 and 1999. So thinking through the attachments that Muslims have to the country, the norms that they've learned over time, the kind of assimilation and acculturation that takes place over time, we have to really understand that this population is rather new to the country. Moving on to the middle table, you can see here that despite a majority of Muslims being foreign-born, a majority of these individuals are actually naturalized US citizens. So for the purposes of those of us interested in American politics, 82% of all US Muslims are US citizens, indicating a valuable voter base that we should be thinking about, especially in political science, as they are located in swing and battleground states. Finally, I really like this table because it indicates so much about where Muslims have immigrated from and how reductive our racial categories are. So if you just consider the right-hand column, you can see, which indicates the national origins of foreign-born US Muslims, you can actually see that 42% were born in the United States, 20% somewhere in South Asia, 27% in the Middle East or another Asian country, 5% from Sub-Saharan Africa, 2% in Europe, and 2% in the Americas, aside from the United States. These are the last two figures I'm going to show, but they're important in terms of demographic as we think about this population. On the left-hand side, just want to indicate that the number of US Muslims has grown substantially from 2007 to 2017, from 2.3 million to 3.4 million. And on the right-hand side, I just want to highlight that Muslim Americans are actually quite a young population. Their median age is 35 years of age, while the US general public's median age is 47. So now we've had our primer on US Muslims, let's have a discussion about this book. The motivation behind the book is to ask one question, which is, what is the status of Muslims in American democracy? And that is just a very broad question, which is why the book leverages many tests to answer it. But before we get to that, I'm going to highlight an argument. The first is that current hostility towards Muslims in the United States in the American sociopolitical context is high. And this hostility is nothing new. Muslims have long been portrayed as being in opposition to an elevated, democratic, and modern West. So while there have been some significant demographic shifts in the group's composition since their early arrival in the 1600s, I argue that the marginalization of Muslim Americans has been manifest to different degrees and towards different segments of the population for centuries. But despite this long history of discrimination, we're going to put that aside because there is particular concern over the status of Muslims in the United States today. In the post 9/11 era, and well before the Trump presidency, the United States had endorsed or overseen legislation, policies, and interventions that affected the lives of Muslims, both foreign and domestic. And these include, for instance, the Patriot Act, the establishment of Guantanamo Bay Prison, the Iraq War, the Abu Ghraib prison abuse scandal, the creation of the Controlled Application Review and Resolution Program, so on and so forth. Numerous surveillance programs that we will discuss. So why should we be concerned about the status of Muslims in recent times? I'm going to give you some reasons. The first is that political elites linked them with the 9/11 attacks. This is a quote from President George W. Bush, not even a week after the 9/11 attacks, when he visited the Islamic Center of Washington, D.C. And I've highlighted the points that I would like you to pay attention to in this passage. What President Bush did then is that he linked Islam and Muslims and otherized them by making them distinct with the attacks. Even though he was trying to say something positive about Muslims, what he did is he racialized them, he otherized them. The quote reads, "Like the good folks standing with me, the American people were appalled and outraged at last Tuesday's attacks. And so were Muslims all across the world. Both Americans and Muslim friends and citizens, tax-paying citizens, and Muslims and nations were appalled and could not believe what we saw on our TV screens. These acts of violence against innocents violate the fundamental tenets of the Islamic faith, and it's important for my fellow Americans to understand that. The face of terror is not the true faith of Islam. That's not what Islam is about. Islam is about peace. These terrorists don't represent peace." Next, there was widespread surveillance programs and prolonged detentions. This is just one example, but the NSA launched a warrantless national surveillance program that lasted from 2001 to 2007, confirming that what many of those in the Muslim population had feared, which is that widespread surveillance was in fact intact. In fact, the NYPD was caught in a surveillance scandal of the Yale Muslim Students Association, which is problematic on so many levels, and so, not just jurisdictionally, but that is to say that even among the most elite Muslims, who have made it to this Ivy League, they were still being spied upon. There was a rise in anti-Muslim bias incidents in legislation. The Council on American Islamic Relations actually reports anti-Muslim incidents. There's a link on their website where you can actually share if you've been a victim of an attack, and CARE begins to investigate things. So I argue actually quite a bit in the book that we should be trusting the CARE numbers and not the FBI uniform crime reports, because, well, oftentimes the FBI is the source of anti-Muslim incidents, as you can see here. What I'd like to draw your attention to is that hate crimes and problems with the FBI and other federal agencies were always sort of in the pre-Trump era concerns in the American Muslim population, but they actually rose to be the most egregious sources of anti-Muslim incidents throughout the presidency and throughout the presidential campaign. There's also been anti-Sharia laws. So for those of you who don't know what these are essentially, there have been several states that have attempted to pass anti-Sharia laws insofar as they're trying to forbid foreign or international law from being applied in US courts. These laws are more symbolic than anything else because the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment of the Constitution actually prohibits the government from making any law respecting an establishment of religion and mandates that no religious tradition can be established as the basis of laws that apply to anyone, including Sharia. But the thing is that these laws have singled out Sharia, and they've argued that it solely violates the First Amendment by treating this one belief system as suspect. And so many have argued that these anti-Sharia laws represent a form of institutionalized Islamophobia. And in fact, between 2010 and 2017, 201 anti-Sharia laws were introduced into state legislatures, and 14 were in fact enacted. Finally, for those of us who are paying attention, the 2016 presidential campaign actually coincided with the Syrian refugee crisis and the rise of ISIS, which yielded quite a few legislator comments about Muslims. So John Bennett, who was an Oklahoma state representative, stated that American Muslims are a cancer that should be cut out of America. David Bowers, who was the mayor of Roanoke, Virginia, called for the registration and subsequent incarceration of Muslims in internment camps. Ben Carson, who was a previous Republican contender, Republican presidential contender, compared Syrian refugees, many of whom were Muslim, to rabid dogs. Obviously, Donald Trump's campaign had called for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the US. And in 2016, Trump even stated that the US should have surveillance of Muslims in the country, particularly at mosques. And Ted Cruz had actually called for the wholesale policing of Muslim neighborhoods in the United States in the wake of the Brussels attacks. And finally, there was the Muslim ban, right? So there were 3 executive orders that were issued in 2017. The first one came not even a week after President Trump had been in office. And the Muslim ban was upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States in Trump versus Hawaii in 2018 and was only recently replaced on the first day of President Biden's presidency. But these are all anecdotal signs, and I argue that each of them is limited. So what I've shown you are signs that the US Muslim population may be experiencing very negative experiences in the American sociopolitical context, that they may be one of the most politically and socially stigmatized groups that we should be thinking about. But this evidence of a backlash is arguably largely conjecture, and in fact, Muslim Americans remain woefully understudied. And I argue that we need more systematic, quantitative, and empirical research in numerous domains to really understand the landscape of the experiences of the US Muslim population. There's 2 empirical limitations in studying Muslim Americans that I'm going to highlight. The first is that we don't actually know the true size and composition of the population, as I indicated earlier. There is no census category for religion. Moreover, the white category is hiding any sort of variation that we may want to leverage from the Middle East or North Africa category. There was an effort for the 2020 census to include a MENA category, but that was removed with the Trump administration. The second issue is that there's very few public opinion surveys that ask about attitudes towards Muslims generally, Islam, the religion, or Muslim Americans as a population prior to 9/11. So it's also hard for us to paint a landscape of how the public might have been viewing these groups. So I'm going to outline my book and provide some answers. My book fills this gap. It conducts a comprehensive study of how US Muslims are treated in a number of different domains that I argue are vital to democratic inclusion, and it examines empirically, using quantitative methods, how American Muslims fare in American democracy. So I ask a number of questions, and I'm going to highlight the questions, and then I'm going to preview the answers before concluding. The first is, how does anti-Muslim hostility, or how do negative attitudes towards Muslims matter for shaping candidate and policy support? To answer this question, I develop a set of survey items that I'm going to call the Muslim American Resentment Scale. These are particularized attitudes towards the group. The second question has to do with political representation, substantive representation, and it asks, how do Muslims fare in terms of substantive representation? For instance, are Muslims ignored by their elected representatives? And to answer these questions, I conduct 2 audit studies on US state legislators to assess bias towards Muslims who ask them for constituent services. Next, I turn to the news media. I ask, how has the news media historically depicted Muslims, foreign and domestic? And do news media portrayals of either group matter for the experiences of the population at home? And to conduct these to answer these questions, I conduct analyses examining CNN, Fox, and MSNBC broadcasts stemming over 20 years, and run a number of experiments to see whether exposure to frames of broadcast shifts attitudes. Next, I ask, would the mass public be willing to vote for Muslim candidates? Here, trying to test whether Muslim Americans have a prospect for democratic inclusion if the public is willing to elect their descriptive representatives. And here I run several candidate evaluation experiments. And finally, I ask, to what extent do Muslim Americans themselves report experiencing societal and institutional discrimination? This last question flips the lens from looking at the mass public, legislators, the media, all these different broad lenses for which it's a bit easier to study these questions and paint a landscape, to the population themselves. And here I look through some unique surveys that I've launched of Muslims to try to understand the extent to which Muslims experience political discrimination. Now, to highlight the answers that the book provides. I find across numerous policies that Muslim American resentment or anti-Muslim attitudes is stronger in its predictive power than other previously proposed items that measure group attitudes. In fact, Muslim American resentment surpasses the standard racial resentment measure across the board, and these results are quite worrisome. Next, in 2 audit studies, I find that there is vast discrimination from elected officials. Muslim voices are systematically ignored by their elected representatives, both Democratic and Republican. So even though Muslims strongly identify with the Democratic Party today, they're not finding strong allies among Democratic representatives. So this can also be incredibly disconcerting for us. Next, I find that cable news media coverage of Muslims is negative over a 20-year period of time. I look at how Muslims and Muslim Americans media coverage fares compared to other stigmatized groups. And I find that indeed, actually the media coverage of Muslims, a foreign group, is increasing, is also very negative and has impacts on American public opinion. So it's quite disconcerting that the media coverage about a foreign population is affecting attitudes towards a domestic group. Next, I find that the prospects for descriptive representation in the candidate evaluation studies I run are quite low when Muslims run as Democratic candidates, but their probability of being elected is higher when they run as Republicans. But there's, of course, a low probability of that occurring because most Muslims who run for office are, in fact, Democrats. Finally, I find that US Muslims perceive a great deal of societal and institutional discrimination. They regularly avoid public places, and in response to the Trump Muslim ban, they reported feeling more visible and open to physical attack, with one respondent even saying that they were afraid they were going to lose their lives. So what can we take away from this book? This book largely asked, how do Muslim Americans fare in American democracy? And answering this question is complex. It requires a multifaceted approach. But I argue that the totality of the evidence that's provided in the book provides empirical evidence of the lowering status of Muslims in American democracy, and that the group situation may perhaps be far worse than we may have previously imagined. This discrimination has not gone unnoticed either, and it's not inconsequential. Muslim Americans are aware of their negative situation in the American sociopolitical context, and they are deprived of fair treatment in our democracy. I argue that the totality of these results indicates that Muslim Americans are currently experiencing substantial hostility and discrimination, and that we should be incredibly concerned about their status. And so when we conduct studies of prejudice, I believe it is imperative for us to also examine the status of American Muslims. And with that, I thank you. I look forward to our discussion.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you so much. And now why don't we give the floor to David Sears, who will comment on Nazita's book. David.
We can't hear you.
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Not knowing this audience and not being able to see it, I wrote out my comments, which I sent to Nazita a few minutes ago, which may not help her, but anyway, so I'm going to read my comments. And I think I should be able to stay within the time limit that you've set out. This ambitious book seeks to cover the waterfront of all the major aspects of the politics of Islamophobia in America, describing public opinion about Muslim Americans both as targets and as agents, as well as their treatment by political officials and the media. The underlying narrative is familiar from previous applications to other American minority groups, a dominant white majority whose prejudices guide them to oppose candidates and policies favorable to minority interests, media that focus disproportionately both in volume and negativity on racialized minorities, minorities who feel victimized by widespread discrimination and who distrust government and who lack adequate representation within and responsiveness from government. It uses an ambitious range of methodological approaches, observational public opinion surveys, survey experiments, and audit studies. Some are quite ingenious, such as an audit study assessing legislators' responsiveness by sending letters requesting a meeting for, alternately, a Protestant pastor with an Anglo name or an imam with a Muslim name. It opportunistically circumvents the dearth of polling about Muslim Americans prior to 9/11, the presumed origin point of serious American Islamophobia, by contrasting media coverage before and after 9/11 as a proxy for the changes it induced in the information environment. The result is the familiar portrait of a stigmatized demographic group down in the racial hierarchy. A new measure of anti-Muslim resentment reveals it to be widespread in the general public with strong political effects detrimental to Muslims. Non-Muslims are reluctant to vote for Muslim candidates. Non-Muslim legislators are less willing to meet with imams than with Protestant ministers. Media coverage of Muslims has become greater in volume and more negative since 9/11. Negative media coverage increases anti-Muslim resentment and opposition to policies favorable to Muslim Americans, but positive coverage doesn't help much. Muslim Americans perceive pervasive discrimination against them and expect it to get worse. In sum, the book is a landmark first pass on applying this racialization narrative to Muslim Americans, and I think it nails it. So that's point one. It's kind of overall assessment. A lot of social science firepower is hurled at the target. The conclusions are dire, as you've seen already from what Nazita just said. I'll quote from the short conclusions chapter, and these are direct quotes, which cites the degenerating situation of Muslim Americans that has occurred rapidly while yielding devastating political consequences with rampant discrimination. Then the quote that she put up already, the group's situation is far worse than previously imagined. For the most part, the analysis is persuasive, but I'm sure that someone asked to comment on the book is expected to highlight the soft spots. Mostly they are matters of excess enthusiasm. I'll just mention a few. The purportedly sharp increase of Muslims in cable news coverage immediately after 9/11 turned out, as far as I can see, only to have occurred, as far as I can see, only on MSNBC. It did not increase sharply, media coverage of Muslims did not increase sharply on CNN until a couple of years later, and on Fox only in the waning years of the second Obama administration. On Fox, it truly skyrocketed as the Trump candidacy came into view. There has, in fact, been no great increase in coverage of Muslim Americans in any of the cable news networks at any time since 9/11. I'll come back to that distinction between Muslims as a target and Muslim Americans as a target group. The chapter on attitude change seemed to me less convincing than the other chapters. The experiments used so-called pre-post designs in which the participants were asked their opinions before being presented with a persuasive communication, then asked their opinions immediately afterwards, opening the door for possibly artifactual appearance of persuasion due to the demand characteristics of the situation. Negative news coverage of Muslims and Muslim Americans had significantly more impact than positive coverage, but the difference seemed to me to be pretty small, averaging about 2% of the scale, if I have it right. The greater legislator responsiveness to the Protestant pastor than to the imam occurred only among Republican legislators, or legislative offices anyway. It's hard to tell then whether that reflects greater openness to the highly religious white Protestant, the core base of the Republican Party, or discrimination against the Muslim imam. Muslim Americans are described as perceiving, quote, rampant political and societal discrimination against them in 2017, but the mean perceived discrimination across 8 items was just passed once in a while and never approached somewhat often. Okay, so what they're saying in terms of their perceived discrimination is once in a while, rather than even somewhat often. Similarly, the fear of future discrimination is described as pervasive, yet the mean level is somewhere between neither likely nor unlikely and somewhat likely. Another survey seemingly invited a critical response by asking Muslims what effects the recent immigration and visa ban has had on you or other Muslims in the United States. A large number of negative responses are listed without specifying the criteria for inclusion or the representativeness of the quotes presented. In terms of the writing style of the book, the author hustles us right along. I like short paragraphs and a punchy style, which is the way she's written it, rather than the frequent academic style of paragraphs that go onward and often inward forever. But sometimes I wanted to tug on her coattails and say, wait, can we go over that a little bit more slowly? Sometimes a complex table or a figure is explained in the text in only a couple sentences. Sometimes the conclusions are somewhat overdrawn. We all know the author to be passionate, so did we ever expect the story to sound as if it was written by a bloodless CPA? Of course not. Okay, then my last points. To repeat, the book falls into the genre of studying both sides of the divide between the dominant white racial group in America and the minority group further down in the racial hierarchy, in this case, Muslim Americans. However, it is sometimes too easy to blur the differences among various groups often categorized as people of color. The familiar contemporary narrative about racialized minorities may share common elements across groups. So yes, they all might be examples of responses to the other, or otherization, as Nazita put it a few minutes ago. Of course, all are stigmatized and discriminated against to some extent, but that may not exhaust what we might say about them. The differences among them may be consequential too. For example, the history of being at the center of political controversy has been a recurrent theme of Black history for 4 centuries, whereas it is far more episodic and often local for other minority groups. The Latino and Asian populations are heavily derived from recent immigration, while most Blacks are descendants of slave families from a century and a half ago. Latins and Latinos and Asians intermarry with whites more heavily than do Blacks, many of whom, like Michelle Obama, for example, bear the hidden heritage of miscegenation with white slave-owning families. The color line may be considerably more impermeable for Blacks in terms of intermarriage and residential location and social identity than it is for Asians and Latinos, a phenomenon I've called Black exceptionalism. These differences might make one cautious about assuming that one size fits all in the simplest version of the racialized narrative. What is unique about Muslim Americans? They are a relatively small group as minorities go. They have not been highly visible in the public life of the nation. There is no Muslim congressional caucus, as far as I know. Most Americans seem to have little personal contact with them. Up until 9/11, they were perhaps not very salient to other Americans, hardly at the head of the line of protests against restrictive treatment of immigrants or the participants in ghetto rioting, or the central figures in frantic calls for law and order. They are, relatively speaking, rather successful in our society, more like East Asians or South Asians than like African Americans or poor Latinos. As the book shows, they are collectively quite well educated. Two last brief points. Much of the research in this book is focused on a category of people known as Muslims rather than on Muslim Americans, though the subtitle of the book refers to Muslim Americans. The stigma attached to Muslim Americans comes, unlike these other groups, primarily from Muslims abroad rather than from the domestic version, despite the subtitle of the book. Social psychologists might suspect that the cognitive associations to the two categories, Muslims and Muslim Americans, are consequentially different. Maybe yes, maybe no. It is striking that the increase in the volume of cable news coverage since 9/11 occurred for Muslims, but not at all in coverage of Muslim Americans. On the other hand, the negativity of the coverage seems not to have differed between the two target groups. So I just leave that on the table as kind of an unknown. That was a question that was raised for me as a psychologist, trying to think about, what are whites thinking about when they think about Muslims, non-Muslim whites, I mean. Is the future of Muslim Americans as dire as portrayed in the conclusions of the book? The intense attention paid to Muslims today seems to have been stimulated by 9/11. The Muslim ban would probably never have occurred without it, so-called Muslim ban. We don't know for sure, of course. Historical counterfactuals always are met with alternative possibilities. But external political events have stigmatized other American minority groups in the past, even though the traces of that stigma seem to have vanished long ago. Despite the betrayal of Pearl Harbor and the subsequent bloody Pacific War and the harsh removal of Japanese Americans to internment camps, Japanese Americans today are on average quite successful. No one calls for the boycott of Japanese automobiles or the exclusion of Japanese tourists. Despite initiating 2 bloody civil wars, costing the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans, Germany is among our most reliable international ally. German cars are highly respected and fast selling, and German tourists are welcome. In conclusion, the book seems to me to have impressively covered the main features of the waterfront. To be sure, it is a first cut and in some places somewhat rough. Sometimes it is a bit overenthusiastic about its findings. Sometimes its fit with the standard racialized minority narrative is a bit forced. The possible differences between Muslims and Muslim Americans as target groups gnaws at me, as I've said. But this book will be an indispensable starting point for any other work on the subject.
Okay, well, thank you so much for those provocative comments, David. Now on to you, Nazita.
Thank you so much, David. I mean, you really have done a really thorough read of the book, and I appreciate it tremendously. I'm going to sort of, respond to some of your points, and I think I'm just going to sort of ruminate on sort of the challenges, I think, of studying American Muslims. So the diversity of the group and the differences by which each of the subsets of the group have come to this country and have experienced identity formation in this country makes it actually quite a challenge to study American Muslims, right? So it's actually really hard to study the group themselves. You have to sort of study it from either, really understanding the intersectional identities that they hold, and then really sort of try to understand how their experiences, their racial experiences, their gendered experiences, their visibility, their immigrant experiences, how all these different these aspects of their identity might be shaping their really unique outcomes in the American sociopolitical context, and that is rather challenging to do, especially when we don't know how many there are, so and who they are and what really the distribution is. We can kind of use the Pew estimates as a rough proxy, but that creates some challenges. Our best estimate today is the Pew estimate, but what I didn't mention is that estimates actually range from 2 to 12 million. The State Department once said there were 12 million Muslims. So you can imagine for those of us who are sort of sitting here being like, okay, well, how do we even begin to put together a sampling strategy? Like, this is actually really difficult to do. On top of that, like, let's think about who are the visible Muslims in America. You know, right now, probably the most visible Muslims in the United States are Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. Right? And Ilhan Omar especially has really garnered a great deal of attention, both among political elites, but also, you know, in the public domain. And the question is, you know, what part of her identity is striking a chord? Is it her Muslim identity? Is it her immigrant identity? Is it her Black identity? Is it her gender identity, right? There's so many different aspects of this identity that those of us who want to study, you know, even what happens to our elected officials when they finally do arrive, you know, it's very hard to sort of try to parse through the experiences of US Muslims and what might be driving them, what part of their identities is driving their perceptions of experiences in the sociopolitical context. I think that this is one group where the pan-ethnic label really does us a disservice. You know, I think that we need a lot more specialization on South Asian Muslims versus East Asian Muslims versus, you know, Black Muslims versus Middle Eastern Muslims. So this is definitely the challenge, the critical challenge in studying Muslim Americans. And then on the flip side, if you try to understand like how they might be perceived, you know, by the American public, the challenge grows even more because the images that are being constantly communicated to the public are those of a stereotypical Middle Eastern person, either a man who is bearded with darker skin or a woman who is veiled. And so the images, I think, that are being disseminated to the mass public are not exactly representative of even the group themselves in the United States. And so this is why, you know, you see in Kansas City at a bar, 2 Sikh Indian men are attacked by, you know, somebody who thinks that they're Iranian, you know, can't even really tell the difference. So I think you know, there's so many different groups are being racialized as Muslim and fitting a phenotype and a stereotype when the American public isn't even aware of them. So these are like some of the greatest challenges, I think, of studying the Muslim population is their inherent diversity of experiences, but also among the group. The second thing I wanted to comment on is the distinction between foreign and domestic. And I think that was a very helpful point that you made. And it's one that I've struggled with a lot, which is that this is a very unique group insofar as foreign events and foreign coverage are shaping our discourse in the country. And that's having an impact on how we view the group at home. Although this might be some sort of, these might be different cognitive processes that are happening that maybe need to be disentangled a bit further in future research. So I think that for those of us who want to understand the experiences of their group at home, it's just what makes them so different, of course, is that at the moment, right now, maybe not right now in this very second because it's COVID, but prior to this, really for the last over the last 2 decades, a great deal of our foreign policy has been targeting Muslim majority countries, and so they have been in our national discussions, and so it's a tricky thing, right? How much of our information about a foreign group is trickling down to a domestic group? I think that, yeah, I think there's we should all be doing kind of a better job at thinking and articulating and theorizing about that. I guess the final thing I'll say is that it's one thing I've always wanted to study is how groups are positioned in the racial hierarchy. You know, as you said, there was a point, right, where Japanese Americans were not welcome or put into internment camps, and yet right? Discrimination, the salience of a group can change, and the treatment of a group can change. Your example about German automobiles is like a very good one as well. So, you know, will this change? You know, where will this move in the future? The treatment of this group, is this a forever thing? Right? Will they constantly be? Will this treatment and these experiences be as dire as perhaps painted in the book? And I'm interested to see how the next few years unfold, especially with the Iran agreement, you know, to see if we're able to enter back in to a deal, a nuclear deal, and see, right? So, so far, perhaps there is a bit more room for optimism. And I'll leave it there. And I want to thank you. I'm just such an admirer of David, and so I'm really grateful for your comments and for spending time to engage with my work.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much. Okay, so why don't we now turn to the audience? Let me see whether there is any. Okay, if anybody wants to ask a question. So far, we have a shy audience, but I want to encourage you to pose a question. Either send me in the chat or raise your hand. All right. So far, everybody is shy. So let me then.
Does David have his hand up?
David, do you want to respond? Yes, please, David.
I think I had two things to what Nazita just said. One is that I think the presentation you just made earlier today really got me to thinking about the diversity of the Muslim population in a way that I was not thinking about as I read the book, and I think it's a terribly important point because they do seem to come from so many different cultural origins. And a related point is that it reminds me of the dilemma that Asian Americans face. We've done quite a bit of research on the social identities of Asian Americans, and particularly among the more recent immigrants, they're much more likely to identify with their national origins than they are with any mythical pan-ethnic group, such as Asian Americans. On the other hand, white people see them all just as most white people see them as undifferentiated Asian Americans, and so you have that kind of disparity between the way the group itself identifies and the way they are viewed by the outside group. And that seems to me to be even more true from what you just said, and not knowing much about it myself, of Muslim Americans. Because when you think of Black Muslims, often converted, not always, as opposed to Persians, I mean, you know, we're talking, this is not, or people from India, you know, I mean, we're not talking about subtle minor differences. And for you to do as well as you've done in studying how that very diverse group feels about being in American society strikes me as, well, you put it as, you call it a challenge. That I think understates it.
Okay, do you want to further reflect, Nazita?
So thank you so much. I didn't realize I was muted. Thank you. Yeah, I just do want to say one thing, which is that the association with national origin is something that's been documented among the like scholarship on Muslim Americans. So people have found, especially among immigrant population, which of course is a majority of Muslims in America, there is a stronger association with national origin, and like not a lot of buy-in into the Muslim group. So a lot of experiments out there, you know, if you can donate to a charity of your home country versus like to a Muslim charity versus to a charity that has nothing to do, you're going to go to one that benefits your home charity. So there's even like in behavior, in charitable behavior, there's these types of outcomes. So it's this is a challenge, you know, when we impose these kind of labels on groups, because even among the Muslim population, of course, we have cleavages that I haven't even brought up, like Sunni, Shia, and those are just the main cleavages. There's so many more denominations. So, you know, we have our work cut out for us in studying.
But on the other hand, the reason the subject is important is because to the majority population of this country, it's a much more unified group, and it's a political group, and that's what makes the subject so important to study. Almost as if, in a kind of Walter Lippmann sense, it's a made-up creature of the imagination of the American public.
Yeah, absolutely.
As opposed to reflecting real flesh and blood individuals.
Okay, terrific way to begin. Marjorie, do you want to go ahead? Do you have the mic?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for this wonderful discussion. I'm sorry I haven't read the book, but I look forward to doing so. I just wanted to see about adding to this conversation about, you know, where, how, where, and when a difference makes. And I guess the one thing I'm wondering about is practices. So, I mean, this phenotype, there's who you're viewed to be, who you're assumed to be, and how that impacts how you're treated. There's how it shows up in last surnames or occupations, or all kinds of ways people decide, oh, this is and bring prejudices to bear. There's also the practices people engage in that that make you more of a member or not a member of a group, and also how one is treated. And sometimes those are not very visible practices. Some might be, but I'm thinking of even, you know, just the equivalent of Catholicism, you know, not particularly visible, but there's a whole set of practices, values, and beliefs that can set people in tension with dominant cultural values. And that may affect how, so I guess I'm just curious about anything you could add as we think about how differences make a difference in the lives of people.
Certainly. I want to take your second question first, and just sort of plug for Vicky Fuca at Stanford. She has a really wonderful paper that I had the privilege to read about adolescents in Germany who, after terrorist attacks, I believe, or after, sorry, with the rise in hate crimes, they actually, there was a drop in how much they expressed their religiosity. So, and she measured this by visiting mosques and like going to, individuals reporting going to mosques. So it's almost like when you're visible and when you're a target, you sort of downplay your attachment to the outgroup. I have seen the same thing in the United States, not through any like systematic quantitative evidence, but through interviews. So especially around the time when there were attacks on mosques, people reported not visiting mosques as much. So in that way, there's like, an effort to protect oneself. There's like a dual role, right? So it's protecting yourself from victimization, but it's also like somewhat of a conformity to the dominant culture, right? So you sort of like downplay those differences. But what did not change, interestingly enough, was private prayer. So daily prayer does not change. And it's the practices that you hold in private that are not visible and that people cannot see as differences that are not overt, that do not change. Which I think is kind of interesting, because that's you would attachments to the group are just, they run deeper than that, right? So I think that's interesting. To your first question about who are they, when do we perceive them? I think there's a lot of people who pass. And are not as visible. And so you certainly see a greater perception of discrimination among those who are just more visible. And
that relates to a question in the chat, just in the Q&A, just by
okay.
Nina Akbar. Yeah, just to...
So we should have a look. But yeah, I mean, I think it's really about visibility and who is identified. I think if I was wearing a scarf today, you would identify me immediately as a Muslim. But if I told you I was in Italy, you might say, oh, she just likes a nice Chianti, so those of us who can pass from one context to another, it's there's a privilege in that. And I think the associations that the associations to the tropes, right, that a lot of Muslims are identified with, they can be lessened by being able to code switch like that.
Okay. Inma Garcia, you have your hand raised. Do you want to, can you grab the mic, or do you want to send me a chat? Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I'd rather ask, because if I have to type my question, we'll be here all day.
Perfect, perfect.
Thank you so much for your talk. I had a couple of questions. One had to do, given the immense diversity of Muslims in America, do you find that there is one group that has more institutional cloud, for calling it, or influence with the U.S. government, and what kind of impact, if so, what kind of impact do you think that has? So that is one question that I have. And then the second question, when we talk about Islamophobia in the U.S., in many ways, well, let me back up. When we talk about Islamophobia in Europe, actually, we located at the intersection. Well, of course, you have the whole historical backdrop of how Europe defines itself in relation to Islam, but also it's at the intersection of that history plus what is being called more recent phenomena that, like, for instance, the racialization of religion or the Islamization of immigration, right? And that's sort of at the crux of that intersection that we locate Islamophobia in Europe. So I was wondering, I mean, certainly in the US, you can also talk, when you talk about Islamophobia, you can also talk about Islamization of the Islamization of immigration. And we saw that in a lot of the policies you talked about. And we can also talk about racialization of religion, but the dynamics are completely different. So how do you see Islamophobia in the US in relation to these things? Thank you.
Thank you so much for these questions. They were brilliant. Thank you. It's just, oh my goodness. I really love to engage with this. So to your first point about, is there one group with a bit more institutional clout among the US Muslim population in terms of being able to sort of liaise with the US government? The answer is yes. So there's a doctoral student at Penn right now. Her name is Hajar Al-Faham. I keep an eye out for her. She's fantastic. She's doing work showing this very phenomena, which is that Black Muslims actually are quite connected to the Black political arm of the Democratic Party. And through this relationship, they're actually able to bring the rest of the non-Black Muslim population into local politics. And so, especially when you see like her work, it's phenomenal insofar as she describes like how historically this has worked in cities where the Nation of Islam has been present. So if there is a group actually that is helping to sort of create a connection or a nexus between the Muslim population and American politics, it's certainly the Black Muslim population. And Black Muslims are 20% of US Muslims, but they're only 1% of the Black population. So there is a notable difference to think about meaningfully. To your second point about Islamophobia in Europe, of course there's a different history, and this is, I'm currently in Sweden right now, where there is a unique relationship with Syrian refugees. I'm here to study and to work on. And when you consider a country like France, of course, when you have these colonial histories, and 20% of your country is composed of Muslims, your relationship historically and currently are going to look different with Muslims. And so the racialization of Islam in their immigrant population looks very different with the racialization of Islam in the United States. But I would argue that there still is a racialization of Islam in the United States that's been formed through a different mechanism. And so while you know, arguably, like Islam has become racialized, or immigration has become Islamicized in Europe because of those colonial histories. In the United States, the way it's worked, the racialization of Islam is really down to our foreign policy. It's the wars that we've launched in the Gulf. It's down to the hostage crisis. It's down to, you know, trying to launch a coup in Iran. It goes back in time, but it's really related to our influence in the Middle East. And so I would say it's much more related to our foreign policy rather than to our like a distinct immigrant group in the United States. And of course, that's been reified a bit with, you know, World Trade Center bombing, with 9/11, with of course all the subsequent events. But I do think through different historical processes, you know, we've come to racialization of Islam in Europe and in the United States that look a bit different, I would say, but coexist.
Okay, let me pose a question sent to me in the chat. So this is from Mizna Akbar, who's an undergraduate attending the program. I enjoyed the talk. Thank you for your time. Did you look into the difference in responses between individuals who might be considered, quote, visibly, end quote, Muslim, particularly hijabi Muslim women versus non-hijabi Muslim women? It would be unsurprising if there were major differences in their experiences with discrimination, but just wondering if you looked into this.
Yes, I have. I've looked into it with my colleagues, Hannah Walker, Aubrey Westfall, and Cassandra Scui. We have a paper called Veiled Politics. And so there we look at the Pew data sets that I mentioned at the beginning. We look over time in these data sets, and we find that Muslim women who are veiled actually perceive greater amounts of societal discrimination. That is, like getting getting prejudicial looks, the type of discrimination you would experience in day-to-day society, feeling unwelcome in public spaces or getting unfair treatment in restaurants or stores. That type of discrimination was heightened among veiled women. And also institutional discrimination as well, which is like the type of discrimination you would face by bureaucrats, like airport TSA, being pulled over more. So we did see that as well. So certainly visibility seems to have play a role in shaping people's perceptions of their experiences of discrimination.
Okay. One second, another question from the audience, from Andrew Lee. I'm curious what your book's implications are for the color line in America. For instance, do you think the color line has become white/non-black, black/non-black, or perhaps a triracial hierarchy?
Oh, that's a good question. It's a hard question. I was told to not take a stance on that when I was writing the book.
But now you please go.
I was told. Vince Hutchings told me, take it out. I don't want to see it, take it out. I think my gut tells me that David is onto something, which is that different groups experience otherization to distinct degrees, depending on like what's happening sociopolitically. Like the context really does matter. I think there is a white non-black divide, and I think the positionality of other groups is somewhere in the middle and shifting, you know, and it's context dependent. At least that's what I would say is my gut feeling, but I don't think my book takes a stance on it because I was told to take it out.
Okay. All right, David Fitzgerald.
Yeah, thanks very much. Many questions, but to begin, I'm wondering if in your deep dive into the data, you have been able to tease apart the differences between attitudes towards Muslims and say Christian Arabs or other non-Muslim Arabs in this country. If you can say anything systematic about the differences between attitudes towards Muslims in the US compared to other countries of immigration and other countries that are not of large-scale immigration, say even China. And then finally, prompted by what David Sears was saying about how surprising it is that, you know, Germans are considered allies and so forth, I just think about the concept of a Judeo-Christian tradition that is thrown around even by a lot of conservatives in the US, which would have seemed completely nonsensical for most of American history, with the prominent role of anti-Catholicism and US nativism. Might there not be some kind of quadruple melting pot down the road? The, you know, Herberg, Protestant Catholic Jew, but that would also add Muslim to that pot.
Very, very good questions. Thank you. To your last one, I hope so, but we'll revisit. So teasing apart attitudinal differences towards Muslims and Arabs and Middle Easterners, like these different types of formulations of how we might posit these groups could be discussed. I do some of that work in my appendix. So especially using the media data, I subset the universe of all media texts that I have, and I look at, well, why Muslims? Why Muslim Americans? Why should we care, right? And I find that, you know, actually in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, the media discussion of Arabs was the one that skyrocketed the most. All groups experienced an increase, all sort of formulations of these groups experienced an increase in coverage. But the coverage of Arab Americans steadily declined, actually in 2003 around the Iraq War. And the coverage of Muslim Americans doesn't skyrocket, but relative to the other groups, it increases. And so I sort of create this argument, which is like, I'm going to study Muslim Americans. They're the relevant group of study, because what was happening in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 is scholars were actually studying all of these different groups. Some were studying Arab Americans, some were studying Middle Easterners, some were studying Muslims. Nobody really knew which group was the right group to study, essentially. And so the book sort of makes its argument based on that finding. But I have done some work that actually finds that attitudes towards Muslims versus Arabs are quite distinct, and the population is actually quite aware of differences. And there is a negative, there's a penalty, like in candidate evaluation experiments. If you, a study that was recently published that I co-authored, candidates who signaled that they were Arab did not face a penalty, but with the addition of a Muslim identity marker, they were penalized. And so certainly subsequent work has shown that the attitudes are in fact distinct. And I think part of this actually goes historically to what happened around 9/11, because for some time, the majority of Arabs in this country were actually Christian. And so especially like for the court cases that we saw early on, like in the 1910s, these naturalization cases that came through that referred to that had plaintiffs from the Middle East, they were actually typically Middle Eastern Christians fighting for privileges of whiteness. And so it's kind of fascinating that that history continued to the 9/11 circumstance, where actually a lot of Arab groups came out and said, you know, we're mostly Christian. In fact, this is not about us. This is not, sort of really trying to create distance from the attacks on 9/11. And so historically, you saw that happen as well. Systematically, I did not compare to other countries, which I think now that you've mentioned it is actually a really great idea to go back and do. Other countries of immigration, try to really see how this coverage might fare. And so I think it's a really great idea, and I appreciate that. But I did look at coverage of China for another paper, and I found that the coverage of Asian Americans was actually for some time very closely linked to their coverage of Asian relations, actually. So like when the terms Asian American just pop up in the media, the story was either referencing them in a list of like statistics with other stigmatized groups in the US, or it was like about foreign policy with other countries. So it does seem like there is a pan-ethnic group in the United States that when they're talked about in the media, they are being discussed with like a foreign, with like a foreign country. And then finally, like the Judeo-Christian tradition, can we see like a quadrupling of it, quadrupling melting pot? I don't know. I mean, I hope so. Like, I truly do hope so. And I have a lot of faith in the youth of America, and in the way that inclusion manifests itself in this next generation. I think this is really inspiring. However, like, you know, any one of us who's read Samuel Huntington knows how traditionally Islam has been manufactured and perceived and long thought of, even among elites in academic institutions. And so, you know, it's a question worthy of stopping and thinking about. I hope that we've moved past it, but I don't know.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. So I don't see anybody else with a raised hand or in the chat. So let me then start to pose a series of questions. I guess the first one I want, you know, you use racialization and otherization almost interchangeably, but it seems to me they can't mean the same thing. So I'm wondering, what exactly do they mean to you? How does otherization differ from racialization? And how do you know racialization when you see it? I mean, it seems to me that the point you made earlier, that visibility greatly alters the likelihood of discriminatory behavior, suggests that racialization is not the fundamental process. That is, racialization. It seems to me behind racialization some easily identifiable trait that produces uniformity of experiences. But here you're telling us actually that a very easily manipulable trait, take the hijab off, put it on. And people do that depending on how they feel when they get up in the morning. That produces a great deal of heterogeneity and experience. And if you add the ways in which, I mean, all right, let me stop. I mean, I'll add one other thing. I mean, Islam is a behavior, unlike Christianity, Islam is a behaviorally based religion. And so, and that then again allows for tremendous variation. And so, and if you add that on top of the incredible differences in socioeconomic characteristics and origins, isn't this a very powerful force pushing against the kind of homogenizing process that results from the antagonistic views or behaviors of, you know, whatever, white Americans or Americans, pure and simple?
So very, very good questions, and I appreciate them. To me, racialization is sort of the coding and treatment of a population that is perceived and treated and perceived as being disloyal or inferior.
Okay, but that's not the perception of African Americans. It's not the disloyalty is not
right.
That's not key there. Could be the inferiority, but definitely not the disloyalty.
I think so. I would argue, and I do in the book, that their racialization is tied to their perceptions of and their tropes of violence, of disloyalty, of inferiority. And that racialization process has occurred through them being coded and named and troped as such.
Mm-hmm.
Now, racialization can happen for different groups and through different processes,
mm-hmm.
right? So the experiences, the racialization of African Americans arguably doesn't have to follow the same pathway as it does for other groups, right? Other groups can end up racialized through distinct processes, I would mm-hmm. imagine. I think otherization is the harder side to all of this. So sort of to sidestep the racialization component and to move to otherization, I think that's the harder phenomena to measure, because that's probably, in my opinion, or at least the way I've been processing it, is like, that's where I see visibility as mattering. Visibility makes you more likely to be identified. It makes you more likely to go through these experiences that are distinct from the experiences of the majority. I think that, at least the way that I've been I've been observing and I've been processing the population is that visibility makes people uniquely susceptible to target. And I would argue that like attachment to a hijab, for instance, is not something that one chooses to take off lightly. I don't think it's something that someone just puts on and takes off. It's very, it's nuanced, right? Like in the sense that for many who wear it, for most who wear it, there's a very strong attachment. And so, as you said, it's a behavioral practice. So I think for me, it's the otherization that's been tied to the visibility. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, okay, maybe it was too flip about the taking off and taking on the hijab. I think that's certainly true in some cases, but I mean, there are a whole range of choices that one in a behaviorally based or ritual-based religion, there are a whole series of choices that one can make in order to. Okay, but let me then move to another question, if you don't mind. So, and that is to think about again, it seems to me, and this is a point that David made also, that one of the distinguishing, I'm not going to say unique, but one of the distinguishing features of Muslim Americans, and especially as it affects their perception by the broader American public, has to do with the external dimension. So again, if we think about compare Muslim Americans to Black Americans, the external dimension for the latter is almost irrelevant. It's all internal. But for Muslim Americans, the external is very powerful. But the external takes different forms. So of course, external, we can think about the Iraq War. That's one type. American intervention abroad, you mentioned. I mean, the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1940-54. Those are all of that. There's that history. But then, you have the Paris attacks. So the Paris attacks, and in this sense, and this I think speaks to your original slide about the Bush quote, Paris attacks, after all, are an expression of a particular, I believe, are an expression of a particular understanding of Islam. So it's an example of conflict within Islam. For that matter, the same thing can be said for ISIS. So that there are events taking place within the Islamic world that then have a series of spillovers outside. And then one can distinguish between, let's say, terrorist attacks, whether Paris or otherwise, and then the Syrian refugee crisis, which is, again, a totally different, there it may be place of the world that is actually important. There it may be more the Middle East, but the Middle East, again, sometimes a spillover. So I guess my question is, given the importance of the external, can you think about the impact of differences within the nature of the external events that then feed back into and remember, I mean, if you think about the other historical examples, it's not an inter-imperialist conflict as it was Japan, US, Germany. But so the nature of the external stimulus is very different.
So the nature of the external stimulus is certainly different, and it certainly varies quite a bit. I think they are related, however. So you don't have a Syrian civil war without an invasion of the Middle East by the Bush administration. You don't end up
but not without a Tunisian revolution either, which was indigenous.
Right, but you do have, right, so there's spillover, right? So like all of these are linked, like there's so much spillover happening with all of these episodes. And I think that it's a feedback loop of sorts. It's really hard, so the linkages I think are there. I guess I would respectfully disagree about the bombings being an expression of Islam. I think this is, one of my pet peeves about like when we call things like the Islamicization of violence, or that to me is, these are hard terms because I think they can be sweeping, and I wish we had better terms. But I guess
I'm saying it's an expression of conflict. I mean,
it is an expression of conflict. It is
conflict within the religion. That's my only point.
It's an expression certainly of differences, of cleavages, of certainly. But I don't know if the average American understands that. I don't know if those differences are made salient to or precisely understood, or the nuances in those differences are being processed or being even communicated in a way that the average person would understand that. I don't know if people draw those distinctions. And so when it comes to the information shortcuts people have to make, I wonder if they're actually making distinctions and understanding the cleavages. I wonder what % of Americans even know the differences between Shias and Sunnis. I don't know. Yeah, which is like, I mean, it's just, yeah. The cleavages are enormous, as we've discussed, in this conversation. Like, so many incredible cleavages in this US-based population. And then when we think about our foreign policy and sort of the groups with which that are sailing abroad at the moment, no one's talking about Indonesia. No one's having a discussion about Indonesia. No one cares. It's not happening. We're talking about Iran. We're talking about Saudi Arabia. We're talking about Syria. We're talking about the Middle East. We're talking about a very distinct population. And I think the fact that the effects of like conflict with these entities can spill over to the experiences and livelihoods of people who have no connection or origin there is really disconcerting, and like important for us to realize that people are not aware of the cleavages and these conflicts.
Okay, Marjorie, do you have your hand up again? Can't hear you.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to go back to the discussion of othering and racialization, just because I think that the Muslim case is really rich not for trying to definitively answer like how are Muslims racialized or where do they fall on the white-black binary, but for how these processes happen and how, when, where, why, and how certain kinds of differences matter. I mean, I'm not sure about this, othering happens all the time. The psychological literature would tell us that we create others all the time. We're creating an us and a them right now. We're part of CSIM, we're part of international scholars, and other people aren't. We do it contextually, we do it in small ways, we do it in big ways. I think you're really interested in the societal level, right? How, as a society, do we create some kind of other that has some kind of stability and duration over time? But the Muslim experience shows us like it isn't fixed and stable. It does depend on all of these factors you've been talking about, and I would argue that does become racialized insofar as people presume you can somehow see or mark or see it as biological or internal or fixed in some way. But all kinds of differences can be made to make a difference. They aren't all. When are certain differences used to make a difference, and how do people experience that process? So that's what I think is really interesting. That's what I think your work can help illuminate. And I am interested, in addition to just the practices like putting on or taking off the hijab or going to mosque or not, there's also more subtle practices that shape how one orients to the world or how you engage with people and school and blah, blah, blah. And that might not be as visible, but it may help mark people as other or not. So it's complex, and that's what makes it so rich.
Terrific.
Yeah, I wanted to add just one more thing, which is that some of my other work has found that in the wake of the election campaign in 2016, after major campaign events that targeted, the first that targeted Muslims and second the election, we actually saw visible online discourse on Twitter among the Muslim population. So we were able to see that there was between a 10 to 20% drop in posts and visibility, just from a very macro level, that was never regained throughout the campaign, and happened at 2 different time points. So something to think about, right? That as you said, these are not fixed, they're not stable, and they're manifest in different ways. So I appreciate that very much.
Okay, well, we've just about come to the end of our time. So I want to thank Nazita for a terrific presentation, for David for a wonderful and stimulating comment, and everybody in the audience for exchanging with us what has been, I think, a very productive session. I want to remind you, we will meet again next Friday, same time, same place, but for 2 hours for the Emerging Immigration Scholars Workshop. So without further ado, thanks to everyone. Have a great week, a safe and healthy week, and looking forward to seeing you next Friday. And Nazita, we will connect on the other link I sent you. Wonderful.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks, everyone.
Thanks, David.
Bye.